We used to think that being a legionnaire was pure heroism. But if you take away the pomp and triumphal marches, all that remains is endless routine, dirt, and waiting. The life of a Roman legionnaire, like the life of any other professional soldier, consisted not of heroic deeds, but of endless routine, hard work, and, most importantly, boredom. A soldier is, first and foremost, a person who lives in anticipation. Anticipation of orders, anticipation of marches, anticipation of battles that may or may not happen. His life is a constant cycle of routine, interrupted only occasionally, and these interruptions can be either moments of supreme glory or moments that will be his last. The longest hours before dawn, when everyone is asleep and you are left alone with your thoughts, your fears, and your fatigue, watch the video to the end and you will learn how these routine 24 hours turned ordinary people into invincible legionnaires. When we think of a legionnaire, we imagine a man fighting for glory and for Rome. But in reality, a legionnaire was a professional worker who did his job for a certain wage. The work was hard, dirty, and dangerous, but it was work. His day did not begin with a heroic rise to arms, but with a monotonous, repetitive cycle of duties. Marching, building camps, digging trenches, guard duty, repairing equipment. Battles were only brief, albeit decisive, episodes in a long and boring life. He spent most of his time doing the routine tasks necessary to keep the army ready for battle. The legionnaire was a builder, an engineer, a border guard, and only lastly, a warrior. He built roads, aqueducts, bridges, and forts, which later became the foundation of Roman civilization. He defended the borders that ensured peace and prosperity for the entire empire. His contribution to history was much greater than simply participating in battles. He was part of a giant mechanism that built the world. He served for 25 years. During those years, he traveled thousands of kilometers, built hundreds of camps, and probably participated in only a few battles. His life was not a heroic saga, but an endless cycle of hard physical labor that required endurance and discipline. For a legionnaire, his immediate surroundings were everything. It was his reality, his world, his family. His tent mates, his contubernales, were the ones with whom he shared everything. Meager meals, cold nights, and brief moments of rest. In this closed male environment, where there was no place for the usual social ties, special relationships developed. Support and mutual understanding were not just desirable, but vital. Soldiers relied on each other, and this gave rise to a deep attachment that went beyond simple camaraderie. A professional army such as the Roman Legion created conditions for the formation of exceptionally close ties. Soldiers marched together, built fortifications together, and shared the last crumbs of bread. In this daily cycle of duties, where everyone depended on everyone else, they became a support for each other. Overcoming difficulties together, whether it was an exhausting trek through the mountains or monotonous work digging a trench, brought them closer than any bond. These bonds helped them cope with physical fatigue, psychological pressure, and feelings of homesickness. In addition to hard physical labor, legionnaires constantly faced psychological pressure. The anticipation of battle was perhaps more exhausting than the battle itself. In this endless waiting, they were left to their own devices and their own thoughts. To cope with this, they found solace in simple things, in conversations, in games, and small, purely human joys. It was in these moments that it became clear that heroism was not about defeating the enemy, but about living another day, keeping one's sanity and remaining human in inhuman conditions. The legionnaire lived not for glory, but for survival. His main task was to survive himself and help his comrades survive. This is what made him great. He was not a hero from legends, but a professional who knew his job and did it well. And his main weapon was not a sword or a shield, but endurance, discipline, and the ability to endure monotony. What do you think was the hardest thing for a Roman soldier? Battle or endless routine? Share your opinion in the comments and we'll discuss it. The Roman day began early. With the first rays of the sun, the sound of a horn woke the entire camp. Getting up, getting dressed, assembling marching gear. Breakfast was quick and simple. Crackers, salted pork, or cheese. No frills. Everything had to be ready for the march. Marching was the basis of a legionnaire's life. He walked 20 to 30 kilometers a day, carrying all his equipment, which weighed up to 40 kilograms. Armor, weapons, tools, food, a tent. All this was part of his daily load. He marched in step with thousands of other soldiers, and this monotonous, repetitive rhythm was his reality. There was no conversation during the march. Everyone was focused on the road, on their steps, on their breathing. Sometimes he walked alone. Sometimes his comrade, his contubernalis, walked beside him, and they shared the latest news, or simply walked side by side in silence, feeling that they were not alone in this endless movement. In addition to physical fatigue, there was also a monotonous background noise, the creaking of armor, the clatter of sandals, the rustling of clothing. This sound was a constant reminder that they were part of a huge military machine that was moving forward no matter what. Life in the Legion was a life of constant proximity. 10 people sleeping in one tent shared everything. Their fates were intertwined, and they depended on each other for everything. It was an environment where personal space did not exist, and camaraderie was the only form of survival. These people became a substitute family for each other, which they did not have during their 25 years of service. In such an environment, exceptionally strong bonds were formed. The soldiers shared not only food and space in the tent, but also their thoughts, fears, and hopes. They saw each other at their most vulnerable moments, when physical exhaustion or tension became unbearable. These relationships, forged in the fire of hard service, became the foundation for mutual support. In a world where every day could be their last, they found comfort and support in each other. In addition to purely friendly ties, there were also more intimate relationships between men in the Roman legions. In the absence of women and prolonged separation from home, such relationships were not uncommon, but rather a part of military life. Historical sources, albeit discreetly, refer to such relationships as a normal phenomenon in the army environment. They were not something that was discussed openly, but neither were they something that was condemned. It was their own internal rule that helped them cope with isolation and loneliness. These were relationships built on trust, mutual understanding, and shared experience, and they were as important to survival as their armor. Thus, the life of a legionnaire was not only physically but also emotionally exhausting. To survive, they had to rely on their comrades. They were part of one big family, and that family was their only salvation. They were not heroes alone. They were part of a collective where everyone depended on everyone else. Their strength lay not in individual heroism, but in their ability to support each other, even if it meant walking an endless road carrying a heavy burden. And this burden was not only on their shoulders, but also in their hearts. But what if the heaviest burden he carried was not on his shoulders, but in his soul? What if the path to camaraderie was as long and arduous as the march itself? Let's talk about it right now. Life in the Roman legion was a life in a collective. Soldiers lived, ate, and slept alongside their comrades. 10 men made up one contubernum, one tent. These people were his family, his friends, his support. They shared joys and sorrows. They helped each other in difficult times. In such an environment, where everyone shared the same fate, the strongest bonds were formed. The friendship that was forged in endless marches and routine work was stronger than any other bond. Soldiers cared for each other. They shared food. They supported each other when their strength failed them. Sometimes these bonds grew into something more than just camaraderie. In a world where there was no place for women, men found comfort and support in each other. These relationships were not publicized, but they were part of the Legion's life. It was their own internal culture that helped them survive. In conditions where every day could be their last, they found in each other something that made life more meaningful. The contubernum system was not just an organizational structure. It was the foundation of social and psychological support. The tent became their home, and their tent mates became their family. They learned to cope with difficulties together, honed their skills, shared stories about home, and dreamed of the future. This daily close proximity created an unbreakable bond of trust that was critical on the battlefield. A soldier knew that his comrade standing next to him would cover his back, and that confidence was as important as his shield. The life of a legionnaire was extremely monotonous, and it was in these relationships that they found solace and meaning. Socializing with their comrades was their only escape from boredom and tension. They told jokes, shared rumors, and played board games. These simple joys helped them maintain their sanity and sense of humanity in conditions that could break anyone. In this male environment, where it was not customary to show emotions, they found ways to express their affection and care for each other. In the constant absence of women, close relationships formed between men in the Legion, as in other military communities. These bonds were not something to be hidden or ashamed of. They were a natural part of their lives, a way to find closeness, understanding, and emotional support. These relationships, based on trust and mutual care, helped them endure the hardships of service. It was a kind of hidden but vital part of the Legion's culture that made life more bearable. Comradeship in the Legion was a vital element that made the Legion invincible. Roman commanders understood that the strength of the Legion lay not only in discipline and weapons, but also in the unbreakable bonds between soldiers. These bonds transformed 1,000 men into a single, cohesive organism, where each was ready to sacrifice himself for the other. This unity was what allowed them to overcome incredible difficulties, endure grueling marches, and win the most difficult battles. Thus, the life of a legionnaire was not just a job, but a constant test of strength of spirit. And they did not undergo this test alone, but together with their comrades who became closer to them than anyone else. After marching and setting up camp, the Legionnaire's day was not over. Training began. These were not just exercises, they were what made them invincible. They trained with wooden weapons that were heavier than the real ones. They learned to build camps, dig trenches, and throw pylons. The training was grueling, but it was also a salvation from boredom. It gave the soldier a sense of purpose, a sense of progress. He saw his strength and endurance grow, how he was getting better and better. Training was the only thing that gave him a sense of control in a world where he was just a small part of a huge machine. They repeated the same exercises over and over again, until they were perfect, until every movement became instinctive. In battle, this saved their lives. They didn't think about what to do, they just did it. Their bodies were trained to respond to any threat. After long hours of training, the legionnaire had only one question. What's for dinner today? Certainly not Sichuan chicken. What was on the Roman legionnaire's menu? Let's discuss it now. The Roman training system was ruthless and effective. Every legionnaire, regardless of his origin, had to go through this tough cycle to become part of a single, well-coordinated machine. Every day they practiced tactical maneuvers, marched in full gear, and did physical exercises. It wasn't just to stay in shape, it was to strengthen their spirit. After all, physical fatigue is one thing, but mental exhaustion from monotony is quite another. Training was also an important element of socialization. While practicing drill techniques, soldiers learned to trust their comrades and feel their support. They trained in pairs and groups, which strengthened their bonds. This physical closeness, joint efforts, and sweat they shed created invisible but strong bonds. It was in these moments that the very relationships that were so important for survival in the Legion were born. These were relationships based on mutual respect, trust, and understanding. During training, when their bodies were pushed to the limit, their minds were free from anxiety. It was one of the few moments when a legionnaire could not think about the future or the past. He was completely absorbed in the present, his body, his movements. This gave him a kind of meditative state that was necessary for maintaining his mental health. Training was a kind of ritual that allowed him to cope with constant fear and boredom. The training system was also a tool for integration. People from different provinces, with different languages and customs, came to the Legion. But during training, everyone spoke the same language, the language of commands and movements. Everyone performed the same exercises and wore the same uniform. This made them equal, erased differences, and made them part of a single whole. Through sweat and fatigue, they became brothers in arms. Thus, training was not just physical preparation, it was the foundation of Roman military culture. It was what made Roman legionaries invincible. It was what gave them the strength not only to win battles, but also to endure the endless routine that was their reality. It was their way of surviving. After long hours of training, the legionnaire had only one question. What's for lunch today? Certainly not Sichuan chicken. What was on the Roman legionnaire's menu? Let's discuss it now. Lunch was a short break in a hard day's work. Soldiers ate whatever was available. Porridge, bread, sometimes meat. The food was simple but nutritious. It gave them the strength to continue working. After lunch, they had some free time. They could repair their equipment, write a letter home, or play dice. It was a time for socializing, relaxing, and forgetting about the routine. They shared stories, joked, and laughed. It was their way of keeping their spirits up. They also did minor repairs. Roman soldiers were jacks of all trades. They knew how to repair their armor, sharpen their weapons, and mend their clothes. These were skills that were necessary for survival. The legionnaire's diet was strict but balanced. The staple food was pulmentum, a thick porridge made from grain, which he ate twice a day. Cheese, salted pork, or lard, and sometimes vegetables were added to it. Wine diluted with water was their main drink. This food provided them with the energy they needed for hard physical labor. They ate together, sitting around a fire, which created a sense of community and unity. Free time was a rare, but very precious luxury. During these brief moments, soldiers could take a break from their daily routine. Many of them kept personal diaries or wrote letters home if they had the opportunity. These letters were their only connection to the world they had left behind. In them, they wrote about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. It was a way to preserve their humanity in conditions that could have turned them into machines of war. In their free time, soldiers could also engage in personal activities. Some of them engaged in small trade, buying and selling goods they obtained during their campaigns. Others engaged in crafts, creating small souvenirs from wood or metal that they could sell or give to their comrades. These activities were not only a way to earn money, but also a way to express themselves, to show their individuality in a world where everyone was equal. It was during these moments of peace and rest, when the tension eased a little, that soldiers could allow themselves to relax and be themselves. They shared their thoughts and feelings. It was a time when they could open up to their comrades, when they could talk about what was bothering them. In this atmosphere of mutual trust and understanding, the very close relationships we talked about earlier were born. These were relationships that were based not on hierarchy and orders, but on mutual respect and sympathy. Thus, lunch and free time were not just a break from work. They were an integral part of a legionnaire's life. They gave him the opportunity to restore his strength, both physical and moral, and to maintain his spirit. They were what made him not just a machine for war, but a human being who lived in a world where there was no place for heroism, but there was a place for hope and human relationships. By evening, everyone returned to camp. After dinner, preparations for the night began. Equipment, weapons, and tents were checked. Everyone had to be ready for any surprise. The camp was their only home, their only refuge in this hostile world. Night was the most dangerous time, not because the enemy could attack, but because it was full of uncertainty. At night, nothing could be seen, and every rustle, every sound could be a sign of trouble. Night watch was the hardest test. The soldiers took turns standing guard. They watched the darkness, listened to every sound. They were alone, and this isolation was the hardest test of all. They fought against sleep, against the cold, against tension. They waited for dawn, which would bring them relief. The Roman camp, or castra, was a masterpiece of military engineering. It was erected every evening with remarkable speed and served not only as a place to sleep, but as a real fortress. Inside this fortress, behind the moats and palisades, the soldiers could feel relatively safe. It was their refuge from the wild, from enemies, from the uncertainty that reigned outside the walls. Life inside the camp was strictly regulated, which helped maintain order and discipline, and thus a sense of security. After dinner, which was usually the largest meal of the day, the soldiers went about their business. They could repair their equipment, write letters, or simply relax. At this moment, when physical fatigue receded a little, they could allow themselves to relax and talk. This was a time when they shared stories, laughed, and reminisced about home. In these moments, the bonds of camaraderie between them grew even stronger. They were not just colleagues, they were a family that shared all the hardships and joys. For many, these evening conversations were the only thing that helped them endure 25 years of service. In this closed male community, where it was not customary to show emotions, the evening hours became a time for quiet, confidential conversations. They talked about their loved ones, their dreams, their fears. It was in these moments that the strongest, most intimate relationships were born, which were so important for psychological survival. In a world where there was no place for women, men found support and comfort in each other. These relationships were not discussed, but they were an integral part of the Legion's life. They were as important for survival as their armor. Despite the relative safety of the camp, the night did not bring complete peace. The night watch was a difficult ordeal. The sentries on duty had to be as vigilant as possible. In the darkness, every rustle, every sound could be a sign of trouble. It was a constant strain that was more exhausting than physical labor. The feeling of isolation and responsibility was unbearable. The soldiers fought against sleep, cold, and tension, knowing that the lives of the entire camp depended on their vigilance. Why was nighttime the most stressful time for a legionnaire, even though there was no fighting? Guard duty was the most frightening word for a Roman legionnaire. Why? We'll tell you right now. Don't switch videos. Night watch was a long and exhausting ordeal. The soldier stood guard in complete darkness, listening to every rustle. His only weapons were his sight and hearing. He was alone with the darkness and his thoughts. At that moment, he could think about his home, his family, his life. He could remember his friends whom he had lost. He could dream of returning home and living a peaceful life. But all these thoughts were only a brief distraction from his main task: vigilance. The watch was not just a duty, but a constant psychological test. Unlike daytime duties where monotony was compensated for by company and physical work, night was a time of isolation. The soldier was alone with the darkness and silence, which was full of its own noises and sounds that made the heart beat faster. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the bushes could mean the approach of an enemy, a wild animal, or just a local who had lost his way. It was a time when reality mingled with fear. To cope with this tension, the soldier turned to his inner resources. He recalled stories his comrades had told around the campfire, jokes that had made them laugh. They remembered the face of their contubernalis, the one with whom they shared everything, and this memory gave them strength. These thoughts of loved ones, of those who slept outside the camp walls, were their only salvation from the horror of loneliness. They were their anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The night watch was also a time for deep reflection. When there is nothing around you but darkness, you begin to think about the most important things, about life, about death, about your place in this world. The soldier could think about what he was doing here, far from home, far from his family. He could think about his purpose, about his future. These thoughts could be difficult, but they were necessary in order to remain human. In addition to the psychological pressure, the watch was also physically exhausting. Cold, wind, rain. These were his constant companions. He had to fight sleep, which was his main enemy. Sleep could mean death, not only for him, but for the entire camp. Therefore, he had to be alert and fight fatigue. His duty was above his own needs. Night was the most stressful time because it was full of uncertainty. During the day, even in battle, you see your enemy. You know what is happening. At night, you know nothing. The enemy could be anywhere, and you can do nothing but wait. This waiting was far more exhausting than the hardest battle. It was a test of fortitude that he had to endure every night. It was this knowledge that he was the last line of defense, that the lives of his comrades depended on him. That was his only motivation. He stood guard not for glory, not for money, but for those who were dear to him. This deep attachment to his comrades, this responsibility for their lives was what made him invincible. He was not just a soldier, he was a defender who stood guard over peace and order. He was the one who made the lives of his comrades possible. The night watch was also a time for quiet, confidential conversations. On those rare occasions when soldiers were on duty in pairs, They could talk about things they didn't dare to talk about during the day. In complete darkness, when no one could see them, they could be themselves. They shared their fears, their hopes, their dreams. These conversations were a kind of confession that helped them cope with difficult thoughts. In these moments, they were not just soldiers, but people who needed understanding and support. Such nighttime conversations were especially important for those who found a second family in the Legion. For them, their comrades were not just colleagues, but close friends with whom they could share their most intimate thoughts. In a world where it was not customary to show emotions, they found support and comfort in each other. These were secret, personal rituals that helped them survive in conditions of constant stress. The Roman legions were not just military forces, they were also centers of civilization. Wherever they stopped, cities sprang up. Soldiers communicated with the local population. They traded, they exchanged knowledge, they built relationships. Soldiers were the best propagandists of Roman culture. They showed local residents how Romans lived, how they worked, how they thought. They were living examples of Roman civilization. The locals, in turn, shared with them their knowledge of the area, traditions, and language. It was a kind of cultural exchange that enriched both sides. Soldiers could also find friends and partners among the local population. It was their way of feeling part of the new world they were building. The arrival of a legion in a province was a major event that changed the lives of the local population. The soldiers brought with them not only the power of weapons, but also the Roman way of life, which was very attractive. They built roads, aqueducts, and baths, which improved the lives of the local residents. These engineering structures were visible proof that Rome was not simply conquering territories, but bringing civilization. It was a powerful tool of soft power that worked just as well as the sword. Interaction with the local population was constant and inevitable. A soldier who had been in the province for 25 years had to live somehow. He bought food, clothing, and handicrafts. He communicated with the locals, taught them his language, and shared his knowledge. It was a kind of daily embassy that contributed to the integration of the provinces into the Roman Empire. Soldiers not only brought Roman culture, they also adopted local traditions, which made Roman culture even more multifaceted. Some soldiers were able to find friends and loved ones among the local population. These relationships could be purely friendly or more intimate. In a world where soldiers were cut off from their homes and families, they found comfort and support in their relationships with the locals. This helped them feel less lonely and more rooted in a world that was new to them. It is also worth mentioning that Roman camps often became centers around which new cities grew. The local population flocked to the camps to trade with the soldiers and provide them with services. This created new economic opportunities that contributed to the growth and prosperity of the provinces. The camp was not just a military facility, but a center of economic activity that benefited everyone. Thus, relations with the local population were an integral part of a legionnaire's life. He was not just a soldier, but a living example of Roman civilization. He was the one who built bridges between Rome and the provinces, who spread Roman ideas and values. And these relations were what made the Roman Empire a unified, cohesive organism. It was not just a seizure of territory, it was a conquest of hearts and minds. This cultural assimilation worked both ways. The provincials did not simply adopt Roman customs, they added their own, creating a unique blend that made Roman culture even richer. For example, soldiers stationed in Gaul could get used to the local cuisine and drinks, and those who served in Egypt could get used to the local cults and traditions. It was a system of mutual enrichment that was beneficial to all. The Romans did not impose their way of life, but offered it as a more attractive alternative. The Roman legions were a kind of mobile city that carried civilization on their shoulders. They were not only a force that conquered, but also a force that built and created. They were the ones who made the Roman Empire great. They were the ones who turned barbarian lands into Roman provinces. And they did this not only with the force of arms, but also with the force of their way of life, their culture, and their values. In a world where every day could be your last, faith was the only consolation. Roman soldiers believed in their patron gods, who they thought protected them from misfortune. They performed rituals, made sacrifices, and prayed for victory. But in addition to the official religion, they also had their own superstitions. They believed in omens, talismans, and magic. They believed that their talismans could protect them from evil and that their omens could predict their fate. This was their way of coping with uncertainty. They believed that their patron gods would help them return home, and this belief was their only motivation. They fought not only for the glory of Rome, but also for their lives and their families. The Roman army was multinational, and this was reflected in its religious practices. People from all over the empire served in the legions, and each brought with them their own gods and beliefs. The Romans were pragmatic in this regard. They did not impose their religion, but integrated the gods of the conquered peoples into their pantheon. The Egyptian Isis, the Persian Mithras, the Gallic Mars, all of them could find their place in the Roman religious landscape. This created a sense of community and unity, where everyone could worship their gods without renouncing their identity. Religious rituals were an integral part of legion life. Before every march and every battle, ceremonies were held in which soldiers prayed for victory and protection. These rituals were a unifying factor that created a sense of collective responsibility. Soldiers believed that their patron gods, such as Mars and Jupiter, would be on their side, and this belief gave them strength and courage. In addition to the official religion, the Legion had its own internal, hidden religious life. Soldiers believed in omens, signs, and dreams, which they believed could predict their fate. Each soldier had his own talisman, which he believed would protect him from misfortune. These could be small figurines of gods, amulets given to them by loved ones, or even just stones that they believed would bring them luck. These superstitions were their way of coping with uncertainty. In a world where every day could be their last, faith was the only thing that gave them hope. They believed that their gods would help them survive and return home. This belief was their only incentive to continue fighting. They fought not only for the glory of Rome, but also for their lives and their families. In this struggle for survival, they found comfort in the most unexpected places. Sometimes they shared their beliefs and superstitions with their comrades, which brought them even closer together. In this shared faith, they found mutual support and understanding. These were secret, personal rituals that helped them survive in conditions of constant stress. Belief in the gods, like belief in their comrades, gave them strength. In these close-knit communities where men were cut off from their familiar family life, they found not only friendship, but also a deeper emotional attachment. These bonds, based on trust and shared experience, were as important as their belief in the gods. In moments when fear and fatigue took their toll, they could find solace in communicating with each other. It was a kind of spiritual and emotional support that helped them keep their sanity and remain human. Each of them carried a part of their home, a part of their faith, a part of their hopes. And all these parts came together as one in the Legion. They were not just a group of soldiers, they were a religious and social community based on shared values and a common faith. They believed not only in their gods, but also in their ability to survive, in their ability to protect each other. This belief was their unshakable strength, which made them great. Thus, faith was not just a part of a legionnaire's life, but an integral part of his survival. It was what gave him strength, hope, and courage. It was what made him human in a world where he was only a small part of a huge military machine. By dawn, fatigue was taking its toll. Their bodies ached, their eyes were heavy, but they knew their work was not yet done. They had to get up and start a new day, a new march, new construction, a new routine. They were part of a huge, invincible machine that moved forward no matter what. Their heroism was not in battle, but in their ability to endure this endless routine. Their heroism was in their discipline, in their endurance, in their ability to keep going even when their strength was leaving them. They were people who lived in a world where heroism was rare and routine was a constant reality. They were the ones who built an empire, not for glory, but for life. The longest hours before dawn, when everything around him was still and the darkness had not yet receded, the soldier on guard felt the full weight of his duty. At that moment, he was alone with his fatigue and his thoughts. He could think about his home, his family, his life. He could remember the friends he had lost or those who had become his family here in the Legion. These memories were his only salvation from the horror of loneliness. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the fog, the camp came to life. The sound of a bugle heralded the beginning of a new day. The soldiers got up, quickly gathered their things and prepared for a new march. For them, it was not the beginning of a new day, but the continuation of the old one, the continuation of the endless routine that was their reality. Their life was a cycle that repeated itself day after day, marching, building camps, training, guard duty, and in this cycle they found their strength. They knew that their strength lay not in their individual heroism, but in their ability to work together as a single organism. They were part of something bigger than themselves, and that gave them meaning. It was in this routine that their invincibility was forged. They were trained to act instinctively, without hesitation. Their bodies were trained to such an extent that they could carry out orders even when their minds were preoccupied with thoughts of home or their loved ones. This discipline was their main weapon. In this world where there was no place for women, friendship and affection between men became especially important. Soldiers found comfort and support in their relationships with comrades, who became closer to them than anyone else. These relationships, forged in the fire of heavy service, were what made them human. They were their only salvation from loneliness. Roman legionaries were not heroes, but professionals who did their job. They built an empire not for glory, but for life. And their legacy is not only roads and aqueducts, but also the idea that even in the most difficult conditions, a person can find the strength to move forward. So, the life of a Roman legionnaire was far from heroic. It was full of hard work, routine, and boredom. But it was precisely this routine that forged the strength that made the Roman Empire great. A strength that was based not on fleeting heroism on the battlefield, but on iron discipline, incredible endurance, and the ability to survive in the harshest conditions. They were the ones who built, defended, and supported the greatest empire of their time. And they did it not for glory, but for life, for their comrades and for their homes, to which they hope to return someday. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what topic you would like to see in the next video. This will help me make the content even better.